Welcome back to the Nerd Cave for part 2 of Lecture 7. It's Dr. Acker. We're looking at editing and proofreading. So for this lecture, I'm wearing both my teacher and editor hats. I brought actually some visual aids to show you some of the materials that I use for editing, as well as some of the reference stuff. Let me go ahead and switch over to our lecture notes, and we'll get right into it. So a good place to start is by looking at how these terms work together. I finished up the last video looking at the revision process. And this is usually what happens just before professional editing and proofreading, if you're in a context where that is available and ethically acceptable. I, of course, don't edit any material that's for a grade for undergrads, just because there are too many ethical gray areas there. But I offer both of these services, and I work on a pretty broad range of material. I generally specialize in academic and business editing, but over the years, I've worked on a lot of different projects, so I want to do a little show and tell before I get into some of the lecture stuff. This is the first book I ever worked on editing. I was on the editorial team. It is a textbook for master and grandmaster level players in professional checkers. Yes, the game checkers, where you jump and do such things, king. And so I have a nice little inscription from the author here, as a friend of mine. More recently, I edited this memoir called 99% True. It's actually a really fun book about music and kind of growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s and kind of forming a business there. And then I also edited this baseball travel diary. This was a fun project as well, looking at how the author visited all of the 30 Major League Baseball parks in one season, back when you could actually go to baseball games and they would play in front of crowds and stuff. So I enjoy editing, and what I tried to do in today's lecture is show you some of the work that goes into that, as well as some of the material that's maybe less evident. We all probably trained to do at least some proofreading, find the typos, fix the typos, and there are different tools and reference materials that can help with that. But it's not just about finding the typos. That is a very common misconception, that even professional editors get paid to run spell check. And so a lot of clients, or potential clients, I should say, well, why should I hire someone when I can just run spell check myself? Well, I hope after the end of this lecture, you'll have a better sense of what goes into that as well. We start by looking at the terminology. So some sources will use these terms, editing and proofreading, interchangeably. There are reasons for that. They generally show up at the end of your writing process. And by this point, you've done your revisions, and so your ideas are pretty much in place. So the changes are relatively small. Sometimes there are a lot of changes. It's not uncommon for me to end up an editing document with 500 changes, but a lot of them are, I'm going to move this period over to the right place, or you said "to" and you meant "the." Fairly minor changes in the whole manuscript. The way I approach this is I define proofreading as the mechanical stuff, spelling, grammar, and punctuation. This focuses on the sentence level. There's also some stuff with dealing with consistency of like how you use terminology. Editing is a bigger process, and I'll show you how these work together at the end of the lecture. Sometimes this starts with proofreading. In most of my cases, I do start that proofread as I go, but it's also about how is this document going to be received? What does the audience expect here? What sort of tone is used? This is appropriate for the audience and for the genre. Certainly looking at word choice. Most of my academic clients are international scholars, and so they speak English as a second or a third or fourth language sometimes. And so sometimes their word choice is not quite as precise as it could be for that context, or they just learned one way to translate a phrase into English, and so I have to find better ways to express that. I focus a lot on clarity. making sure that even in the most technical arguments, that the main claim is clear and that it's likewise clear what evidence is there and how you're using that. And so I focus a lot of that you've seen in my grading as well. I also look at how the argument is set up. Does this make sense? What I tell my clients is that I approach this as an educated non-specialist because I'm not an engineer, I'm not a physicist, I'm not a creative writer even, but I know enough about language and writing and communication that I can find ways to help them present their message better, and in the case of academic documents, to make that argument kind of make sense. So I give them feedback on those terms, both on the logic and the structure of their arguments. Whether I am focusing on editing or proofreading a given project, I try to make sure the writing is correct, consistent, and clear. So the three C's there. Let me start by looking at editing, which is the bigger process, and we'll go to proofreading and kind of circle back and see how they both work together. A big part of the work that I do and kind of editing on the professional level is about read and interpretation. And this is one reason why you see a lot of English majors pursue careers as editors. Some of it is just we tend to be more trained in writing, but we're also used to dealing with texts. In our case, it's most often creative texts. But when you spend 4 years of an English degree figuring out how does this character work, what is this image doing, how does this scene go together, then it's easier to take another argument, even a nonfiction argument, is most of the stuff that I work on is nonfiction, and say, how is this going to hold together? What is the reader going to get out of this, and is this what the author actually means? So the first question I ask, and the first question I encourage you to ask as you go through and edit your own work, is what is that primary message? What is the main takeaway? And as best I can, I need to figure out how the author is trying to communicate it. Especially in creative text, it's very important to maintain the author's voice. And that could be in things like the sentence structure. There are a lot of short sentences. How does the author tend to set up a paragraph? How does the author tend to present evidence? And from there, I have to think about the audience. So in academic settings, often the audience will be specialists. For a journal article, you're going to want to know about the technical details of your experiment or your analysis. They're going to start with a fairly high baseline knowledge, but they may not know a lot about your specific topic. And so it's, again, it's one of those things of balancing the new information with the information they already have, showing that you respect their knowledge, but also showing that you have something new and interesting to communicate. I also think about the standards for the genre. So you are writing in academic genres in this class, particularly, you're doing a literature review for paper 2, which I'll talk more about in my next lecture, whereas you did a rhetorical analysis for paper 1. And so part of the revision process and part of sort of kind of that communication of what needs done in each draft is about the standards for that assignment. In this case, you have a rubric to go on there. In other cases, maybe there are different sets of expectations for the audience. The audience for the checkers textbook I edited is extremely different from the audience for the baseball memoir. Now, there may be people like me who enjoy both baseball and checkers, but they're going to come at each text with a different set of knowledge and kind of expect things to be organized in different ways. One of my jobs as an editor is also to kind of advocate for the reader. So I take the reader's place, not just because I'm literally reading the book, but because I have to think, how are they likely to respond to this? Could there be objections to a term, to a tone of voice, even to an entire line of argument? And what do we do with those? is this minor enough that you can say, let's try to put this a little bit more nicely, or let's maybe not try to offend this group of readers? Or is there another way to deal with those concerns? And again, thinking back to the naysayer that I talked about in my last video, sometimes you have to be the naysayer has to be the reader. So if they're going to see this term and would say, if they're seeing, you describe this as a cancer on the fabric of society, is that going to be effective for them? Or are they going to say, you know what? My mom had cancer, or I have cancer, or I lost my best friend to cancer, and that's really insensitive, and I'm going to put your book down and leave you a nasty 1-star rating on Amazon. Because there are questions the authors have to consider and the editors consider. Got to remind them sometimes how to do that. And there are also, of course, a lot to do with the style and mechanics. And this is where a lot of the training comes in, both in terms of learning how your target language works and figuring out what is an appropriate style for a given audience or genre or author. There are often two kind of reference materials in play here. One is the style sheet and one is the style guide. The style sheet is often specific to an organization. So let's say your company always wants to capitalize maybe a certain slogan or a certain phrase, or they always want to say like it's Coca-Cola, or both are capitalized there. That will go in the style sheet, so that whatever the dictionary says or whatever the style guide says, you override that. You say, I'm going to put things this way. So my colleagues who work on fiction editing will keep style sheets with character names, make sure that they're spelled correctly, or if they notice that the author always hyphenates a certain term and the dictionary says you can either hyphenate it or not hyphenate it, they want to make sure that that's all consistent. I used to do proofreading for Nationwide Insurance. They have their headquarters back in Columbus, where I lived. And one of their style sheet instructions is we don't use the Oxford comma, which hurts because I love the Oxford comma. The Oxford comma is when you have a list of items. Say I went to the store and bought milk, bread, and eggs. The Oxford comma is that last one: milk, comma, bread, comma, and eggs. They would leave that out, and so when I proofread for them, I had to take that into account as I was fixing their sentences. So that's the style sheet. The style guide is what you're probably more familiar with because we use them in academia. So I have show and tell. Editions are a little bit older. This is the 7th edition of the MLA style guide. This is the APA publication manual, and this is the granddaddy, the Chicago Manual of Style. It's 1,400 pages long. I have not read all of it, but if you have problems with insomnia, you can read through the section on commas, which is like 400 of those pages. Some publishers and some magazines and places like that will say you must adhere to the style guide, and some authors will say, well, I have my own style sheet, and so there's a little bit of conflict and tension there. As I edit, I also think about how other things in this setting or this genre have been presented. And this is where voice or tone comes back in. Sometimes there are templates for a given style, let's say a report. One of the projects I worked on a few years ago was working with a consulting company, and their job is to consult on the quality and longevity and composition of airport pavement. That's all they do. They're very good at their job, but they had to put together, they got this contract for inspecting all these airports in the state of Florida. And so they had to come up with a way to present their findings consistently. The difficulty was that the reports were being written by 4 or 5 different engineers who didn't follow each other's standards necessarily. None of whom spoke English as a first language. And so when I took that job, the first thing I did was go through their existing template and fix the whole thing. go through and reorganize some stuff and figure out what terms to use there, consulting with the subject matter experts and my contacts at the company, and say, let's set this up first because we've got 35 of these reports to do, or however many they had. There are lots of airports in Florida, and I want to make this as consistent as possible. And so we did that early on, and then for the future reports, we were able to say what has actually changed from the kind of the default, the boilerplate, and what's the same. So then I would just proofread the new material, save them time and money, save me time in going over everything, and that we made sure it was consistent across the board instead of thinking, did I do this the same way in report number 17? I didn't report 2 because I don't remember how this worked exactly. I mentioned tone of voice in a narrative. This tends to be more important, but even on a corporate level, a good example of this is social media responses. So regardless of who is actually writing the comment or responding to your message or answering the chat bot or whatever it is, the company wants to be hopefully friendly and professional, but they also kind of want to project a certain image as part of that. So this is why some companies have really entertaining, say, Twitter feeds. Wendy's has a great Twitter feed. And why some focus a little bit differently or maybe use a little more cut and paste as you go through it. So this is, again, part of reading, kind of getting to know the context. Part of style and mechanics, and it's just all about language. So you want to think about what is going to reach this audience in this genre best. Now, in Southern California and in several areas of the US, there's a very large bilingual population. So it makes a lot of sense to have documents typically around here in both English and Spanish. For example, I think it's the San Bernardino County Health Board or whatever their office is, on their Facebook page, pretty consistently posts the same material in English and Spanish, at least for the important updates. On every post gets translated, and that makes sense because they're going to have readers who are fluent in one or both languages, and they want to be able to reach stuff consistently. And as you get kind of to more official material, I got my census form, and there were translations in several different languages, at least in the instructions, to potentially reach all those different audiences. You also want to think, as part of this, about individual dialects, because not everybody, for example, is going to speak or read the same type of English or Spanish or German or French or Korean or whatever it is. For example, my mom and her siblings grew up in Japan, and they grew up in a fairly rural area. And so while they did learn sort of the standard Tokyo dialect in school, they also learned basically redneck Japanese in their village. And so sometimes they will switch those dialects. And I can't quite track it because I don't actually speak Japanese, but the accents are always a little bit different because they kind of exaggerate. They draw out the vowels in their rural dialects. And so that sort of choice in how to reach an audience can make a big difference. There are actually Wikipedia pages in different dialects of English. It's kind of fun to read around them sometimes. Similar choices, thinking about the level of formality. If you are writing, an email to your professor, you want it to be somewhat formal, respectful and clear. But if you're just kind of chatting to your friends, it would look weird if you were super formal. In some cases, you might have what's called code switching. Code switching is a lot of fun. It is the linguistic phenomenon where you go between dialects or entire languages sometimes, depending on what you're talking about or what you are trying to communicate in terms of the tone or to reach different people. If you ever have seen Bollywood movies or TV shows, they do this all the time, and it's really disconcerting if you don't know both languages. Because one showed up on Netflix the other day, and it's like, oh, well, this looks kind of interesting. I started watching it. It's like she just said 3 lines in English, and I don't know what the rest of it was. I think it was probably Hindi. But that's normal for that audience because basically everybody who would be watching that is reasonably fluent in both of those, so that it switches between those two linguistic codes. And then, of course, there's the mechanics. And I'm going to talk about the grammar stuff in terms of proofreading. But one thing I have learned about editing is that in the same way we have unique writing styles, sometimes we have problems in the mechanics or just in kind of awkward ways of explaining certain things that are common to individual writers. And I learned this often with my students, and I've certainly seen patterns in my own writing. Like, oh, I did that same sentence structure again and again and again. I really need to stop doing that. One thing that I found helpful in editing, and I think this also transfers well to editing your own work, is getting a sense of how the linguistic background, or sometimes the national background, affects how my authors use English. For example, I work with a lot of scholars from China and Japan and Korea. And I noticed, very early on in editing their work, that there were a lot of missing articles. So, like where we would say, I read a book, they would say, I read book. And it was a little mystifying to me until I actually started studying Korean. And I learned that in Korean, and I think it's also the case in Japanese and Chinese, there are generally not separate words for articles in the way that we would imagine them. If you write a Korean sentence, you actually have an extra syllable that you plug in to the subject, and you say, here's the word subject. And so if you're used to writing in that language and you suddenly go into English where we have separate words for everything, then it makes sense. You're going to miss some of those. So I found that the more patterns that I learned there, even if I don't actually speak the original languages at all, that I'm able to predict what sort of errors to expect and just kind of how the style is going to come together. Because it's not necessarily a mistake, but maybe it's a way of structuring a sentence or structuring an argument. Going back to the idea of a style sheet, sometimes non-standard usage is fine. A slang term might be perfectly acceptable in a marketing outreach that you would never put in a formal academic paper. Likewise, there are many, many technical terms that don't work the way they would in kind of everyday conversation. I've always run into these in engineering documents, especially. I don't think that's a word, but I'm going to Google it, preferably Google Scholar, and see does it actually show up in other forums, because it could be just something I haven't encountered yet. So we'll look at how editing and proofreading work together in our case study, but I do want to go over some proofreading techniques before we get there and get a few grammar points while I have you here. Honestly, a lot of proofreading is being very careful about the little things that's normally slip by, because if you slow down and look at a document, and it's like at the individual sentence or word level, you think, oh, obviously I didn't mean that word. I'll write the correct one instead. But it takes a certain amount of focus and a certain amount of obsession with how the language works and what is actually correct, because it's very easy for us to overlook stuff, especially in our own work. And there are all sorts of collections of unfortunate typos on the web. Sometimes autocorrect is the culprit. Sometimes it's just, I left out a really important letter. The one that every editor lives in fear of missing is when the author means to write public, like public library, and misses a letter and writes pubic library. That's something very, very different. The other things here, you probably noticed in your own work, homonyms are words like there, over there, I should say. I realize I don't have it on the screen now. There, as in belongs to them, and there, as in they are, or your, and your, or two, and two. It's really hard in speech, and that's kind of the point. But you've seen people make these mistakes on Facebook constantly. It's easy to miss because if you're saying it to yourself, there's no distinction. And sometimes this also goes back to language. I have run into Spanish speakers that I work with as clients or as students who will misspell words that are like, what was it? So let's say we have hid, H-I-D. It might show up as heed, H-E-E-D, because that's the way their accent kind of renders it. So there are all sorts of things to keep track of here, and I'll share some techniques for catching as many of those as you can. But this is an ongoing struggle. I have to proofread my stuff all the time. So how do you do this? Well, as you're proofreading your own work, you want to be honest about where your weaknesses are. Those might be in particular areas. If spelling is a struggle for whatever reason, then double check all the spelling. Think back to other papers. Where did you lose points? Where was stuff where you were less confident about your argument? And I mentioned that because when you're focusing a lot on just getting the argument right, it's very easy to overlook the spelling. And it's like any time you're developing a new skill, if you are focusing on something new and difficult, then something you obviously knew what you're doing before, that was easy in previous iterations, is going to be really hard. It helps a lot to read out loud and read your paper slowly, because you're going to hear some mistakes. Homophones, it doesn't really help, but for other things, if you force yourself to read every word, then you say, oh, that doesn't sound right, or even, is that comma in the right place? Because that pause doesn't sound very natural. If you have revised material, and you should revise materials I talked about in my last lecture, then you want to pay special attention to that new material. And sometimes it's the case of going between drafts of the same assignment, but sometimes it's also writing similar documents. I've caught myself, sometimes I will copy and paste like a template for, say, contacting a new client, or say, hey, I'd like to bid on this editing job, and I will accidentally copy over the previous client's name and call the person by the wrong name, which is really, really embarrassing as an editor. But I've also occasionally had clients who will write on similar topics or to similar audiences, but they'll say, I've changed, I'm no longer addressing this audience, is from audience from a different country, so please make sure that I change the adjectives over so that I'm talking about the new country. The kind of most awkward version of this is when you're writing cover letters and you have applied to multiple companies or multiple schools, for example, and you accidentally leave the name of one school in for the new cover letter. That could get really awkward because Apple might be very impressed that you're applying to Microsoft, but you probably don't want to tell them that. There are some tools that can be helpful. Plugging stuff into Google. Google is getting reasonably smart about detecting what words you mean, but sometimes they will still suggest the wrong ones. I don't need to tell you that people occasionally make mistakes on the internet, and sometimes Google still records them. So you can put in the phrase pubic library and it will come up on Google. It doesn't mean it's right. Regarding Grammarly and other software, I generally don't rely on it. Grammarly has the free version and the pro version, and the purpose of the free version is to get you to buy the pro version. So they'll tell you, well, we found 10 mistakes, but there are 25 more that only the pro version will tell you about. Pay $59.99 or whatever. Don't do that. Grammarly will actually mark stuff as wrong that's correct, and we'll mark stuff as correct that's wrong. The spell check in Google Docs and in Microsoft Word is a little bit better, but it's still garbage in, garbage out. It's run by a computer, and so you need to develop the human instincts and trust those more than you're trusting the software. And if you're in doubt, you literally have an English professor who is a professional editor. Ask me, ask your classmates, ask your mom, ask your sister, ask somebody just to get a second opinion on how this works, and you can get some help there. With that, I want to go over some specific grammar issues and problems that I see often in student drafts. I try to mark these when I see them. I don't mark every single error in a draft because I don't have time, and because people tend to get overwhelmed if they see 500 comments on their 3-page paper. I exaggerate only slightly. But I do try to mark at least one instance so I see a pattern of error. So sentence fragments and agreement errors are near the top of that list. Going back to kind of 3rd grade English for a minute, you need complete sentences. So that has to have an independent clause, a subject, and a verb. You can't have an implied subject. If you say study for the exam, it means, hey, I'm talking to you. But in most cases, you need to have a clear subject, a clear verb, and often a clear object, or at least a prepositional phrase is in the case in that sample there. Sometimes you end up with an accidental subject sentence fragment if you hit the period key too soon, and then Word will helpfully start a new sentence for you because it saw the period and said, oh, this is a new one. But it's also easy to overlook that. So I do try to mark those as I go. I give you a resource you can have for your files there. In terms of subject verb agreement, you need to have the person and number match up. So person A is say Sunny and Cher, right? So Sunny sings 2 songs. One person, so here's our singular, there's our singular subject. So we conjugate the verb as sings instead of sing. And there's our object. But if we have 2 subjects, this is called a compound subject. Sunny and Cher sing, because it's 2. Also, the singers sing a duet. So guide to grammar is also helpful there. On the Science and Society website, if you have access to that, if you buy a new book, then you can also pull up the grammar exercises there, but these are helpful supplementary materials. Likewise, if you have a pronoun, it needs to agree with the antecedent. Antecedent just means the word the pronoun is replacing. So for standard English, Sunny sang his part while Cher sang her part. Meanwhile, the musicians played their part. Singular, masculine, singular, feminine, plural. If you happen to know that the subject, the one that you're referring to here, uses a different pronoun, then you can substitute that in. But that's a slightly different political context, which I don't really want to get into right now. So there's the reference on pronouns. The second grammar topic that I see a lot of errors in is commas. And as I mentioned, the manual style has a lot of material on commas. So there are way too many rules because English is kind of insane. But I want to focus on a couple of related problems, comma splices and run-ons. There's an overall handout, Writing Center, UNC.edu, great website. To understand these errors, you need to go back to dependent versus independent clauses. So an independent clause is a complete thought that could stand on its own. So I went to the store. If you have, I went to the store to buy milk, you got 2 clauses. One is independent, but to buy milk doesn't stand on its own, so it's called a dependent clause. Now, when you have 2 independent clauses, you need to separate them in certain ways to make this right. You can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. And that's the coordinating conjunctions are the fanboys, for and nor, but or yet so. So here, do not fear, for I am with you. The comma place shows up when you use a comma, but you leave out the conjunction just to separate them. So this is a mistake. Do not fear, comma, I am with you. I see often this shows up with, this error shows up with one phrase here and then the word however. I am with you, for example. I wrote the paper, however, I don't think I did very well. That's a little, it's easy to miss, but that is a comma splice error as well. Similar mistake here is two independent clauses without punctuation. That's called a run-on. So, mentioned you can add the comma and conjunction. A couple other fixes. You can change the comma to a semicolon. Semicolons are awesome. Or you can break the sentence up into two or more sentences. And sometimes I'll suggest those changes in the rough draft instead of just saying, hey, this is a comma splice. Last thing I want to look at is quotes and citations. I added a lot of comments on rough drafts to clarify where the citations need to go and to clarify what they should look like. So you can follow those patterns to correct your paper one drafts. Couple of things on punctuation here. In US English, commas and periods go inside the closing quote marks. And if you leave words out in the middle of the quote, so you're quoting either end of it, you do need to have these ellipses, the three dots, but you don't need them at the front or the end. I see occasionally a quote that'll have dot, dot, dot. Here's the part I'm quoting, dot, 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 just to indicate it's part of a sentence. So you can go ahead and delete the ellipses there. When you have in-text citations, regardless of MLA or APA style, it comes after the quote. So here's our actual quote. The ending quote mark comes here, and then the parentheses starts the citation. And the period, or usually sometimes a comma, goes at the very end there because that's where the sentence ends. So a couple resources, one for MLA and one for APA, and I tried to, again, to correct these on your rough drafts as well. All right, let me finish up then by showing you how these processes, editing and proofreading, can work together. So I'm going to switch over here. I'm going to show you a case study of a document that I edited a couple years ago. This was a cover letter, and it was for a scholarship application. In this case, one of my tutoring students was writing it, and so he asked me to take a look at it. And cover letters are probably one of the more complicated genres for writing because they're short, usually no more than a page, sometimes 2 pages, and you have to do a lot of different work in them. And so I do a lot of editing of these, especially for job applications, and I think it's a good example of how these processes can work together. So I'm going to pull up the PDFs of the different versions and show you how this might work out. I'm going to start. There we go. Where is the original? Start over here. Okay. So if we were meeting in person, then I would actually have you guys look at this and practice finding errors. That's actually a good practice. I'm not going to post the PDFs just to make sure they stay private, but even if you just take a minute or so here and look at even just this first paragraph, you could probably find some material that doesn't work on a mechanic level, on a stylistic level. So if you look at that, I'm going to get a glass of water. You're probably noticing things like with GPA 4.33, we would say with a GPA of 4.33 and a class ranking of 31,478. You might also notice that there are some typos. I'm passionate about this. What he means to say is pursuing the medical field. Microsoft Word and Grammarly are going to miss this. because perusing is a word. It's just not the right word. We have phrases down here in the bullet points. I have completed or in progress. That doesn't make sense in English, so we have to figure out how to reword that. We have honor biology, science, honor chemistry. Let me see, and probably honors. You might have also noticed some inconsistencies here. Hilliard Davidson High School should be capitalized because it's the name of the whole school. This is one that I actually missed the first time through. Right up here, Ave should be A-V-E for avenue, not A-V. I completely overlooked it. As we get on through the rest of the cover letter, we start noticing things that may not just be proofreading questions. So we do have some errors in punctuation here. Here is a comma splice and a capitalization error here. Here's a sentence fragment, also help out special needs students. We've got a set of categories here that aren't quite clear. But it's not just the proofreading. So in this particular case, I had a little bit of a different setup because, as I mentioned, it was for a tutoring student, and we met every Saturday. We're working on SAT prep. So honestly, I read this draft, and I was a little bit worried because we had been working on these grammar questions in the SAT tutoring sessions, and I knew that my student could do it. So I saw this and I thought, we have a lot more to work on than I thought we did. But I was also a little bit confused by some of the content. And this is where the editing and the proofreading kind of come together. The proofreading part might take a sentence like this and say, well, we need to fix this phrase and say with a GPA of and a class ranking of, and make this Hilliard Davidson High School all caps, all capitalized. But the editing part would say, why is this important? And what sort of rhetorical function does this play in the cover letter? One of the things that I tell my business writing students when we talk about application letters is to clarify what you're actually talking about. You know, why are you sending them that letter? Because, especially in this context, look at the addressee. This is going to the department chair of, I believe, the molecular genetics department at Ohio State. This is a very smart and very busy guy. And so you should probably think he's going to get a lot of letters, maybe a lot of applications, and he wants to know why you're writing. Probably also don't want to call him by his first name here. But that's another proofreading issue. In fact, there's only this reference here. This position is a high school research assistant. And then at the very end, we have this line, I'd be thrilled to hear from you about any research opportunity for high schoolers. So if I'm reading this letter, I'm going to be pretty confused about why this person is writing to me and what sort of job he's looking for. And so I had some questions about stuff like that, like what is this program and why are these particular things relevant? And I had more questions as I went through. What are these courses? Are they specifically relevant? What does Key Club do here? What is a scientific rules judge? What does it mean to mentor these teams? What's the volunteer hours? What does it mean to help out special needs students? Because that could mean a lot of different things that could be more or less relevant depending on the job you're applying for. If this is kind of a personal care setting, there may be a different set of skills involved than it's, you know, do I help them find their classes? Do I tutor them? All these could be relevant skills, but I just don't know why they're relevant. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about editing. I got to know what the audience wants and what is expected in the genre. And the same thing here. I did not figure that the reader is going to know what these are. So, because I was going to meet with my students, I did a preliminary draft of the edits, and I said, let's sit down on Saturday and go over this because I have several questions for you, and I'm going to have to change some stuff depending on your answers. So this is what the first round of edits looked like. You can see I did a lot of changes. The black print is stuff that's in the original. There's not much left. The red stuff is new, and the green stuff is stuff that was original, but I moved around. The argument is pretty similar in this first draft. I moved up the kind of clarified what the person was doing, but I didn't know a lot about the context still. So I think I fixed all the grammars. I mentioned I missed the ab up here. But we actually sat down and started talking about this document. And it was an unusual experience because I started asking my student questions about, so you say this is phrase here, working key club, can you tell me what that is? And he said, what? I said, oh, well, let's look at this other one. What job are you applying for here? What is the high school research assistant job? I said, oh, I don't really know. Finally, I just showed him the letter. I said, okay, why don't you read through this and tell me what you're talking about, and then we can start editing it. And he started reading it, and he said, oh, I didn't write this. My dad wrote this letter. He sort of mentioned he was going to do something like that. And suddenly the grammar made a little more sense because I knew my student could do it, but I met his dad, and his dad's English was a little worse. It was a lot worse. He's a very nice man, but he'd not done a lot of the tutoring. And so we had to revisit a lot of these and kind of redo the letter from scratch because there's a lot of information that his dad just didn't have or that he kind of misremembered. And so we spent some time doing research. We looked at what does the Key Club actually do? What were some of the events that the student had participated in? What program was he applying for? What sort of jobs were available? We looked at the volunteer experience here and asked questions like, what did you actually do? And so this is where we ended up. For one thing, we found out that the thing he was applying for was called the OARDC Research Internship Program, and it was run by someone else. So it wasn't the chair of the Department of Molecular Genetics. It was someone on a different campus in a different city at the Worcester campus of Ohio State, which is 2 hours away from Columbus. So if he had sent the letter, it would have gone in the trash. So we found the right person to talk to, clarified that up front here, and then kind of went into the qualifications. And the one thing I asked my student is, do you have a resume? Because it would make a lot more sense to me to include the resume, because that's this stuff here, and then to use the cover letter to kind of explain how does this specifically prepare me to meet your organization's needs to do this job. Well, he did not have a resume, unfortunately, and so we kept this in, but we did try to clarify how that worked. For example, in the original draft, we had this phrase, I've completed or in progress the following courses. And in the final draft, we changed that to, by the end of the school year, I will have completed these courses. I gave a specific example here of something that the student had actually done in Key Club, because he wasn't actually a scientific rules judge, so we took that out. Unfortunately, he might be less qualified for a scientific position, but it's honest, which is the important thing here. Also clarified that when he said I helped out special needs students, that was event planning. So planning and organizing a prom event could be something useful to talk about. And clarified that this was volunteer service in Key Club. For the hospital experience, I said, let's not worry about the different areas or the different departments. Give me one sentence on what you did. And we came up with this one. This, I think, is a lot clearer because it shows what has he actually accomplished and how could that be potentially relevant. Does clarify that he wants to work in the Department of Molecular Genetics here. But overall, I think this is a much stronger cover letter, not just because the typos are gone, but because it takes into account who is the audience, what is the genre, and what is the rhetorical situation in which you're writing. And so you want to think about all of those things as you are revising and editing and proofreading your papers. Don't just fix the typos that I found for you, or even the ones you found yourself or your peers found, but make this the best paper you can. As you finish up the paper one revisions, those will be due, as you know, on Tuesday night, tomorrow night. I hope you find this material useful. If you're unsure of whether the revision works, feel free to reach out to me and I will give you some feedback on that. I'm not going to go through and rewrite the paper for you, but I am an editor and a teacher, so this is part of my job. But I just kind of want to give you a sense of how these processes can work for your benefit. So we'll finish up with that. In the next lecture, I'll be going over some background and context for the Stanley Milgram shock experiments. That was a fun chapter in psychological scholarship in the 1960s, as well as talking about paper 2. So we'll put that up in the next couple of days. Meanwhile, get those readings ready, finish up your revisions, and I'll see you back here for lecture 8.